It was a chilly Wednesday afternoon when Marcus Williams, a well-known entrepreneur from Chicago, walked into Westwood Medical Center. His company had recently donated large sums to the hospital's new cancer research wing, and he'd received several thank you notes. Today, however, he wasn't there for the usual philanthropic meetings. Marcus had a minor surgery scheduled to remove a benign cyst on his back. The moment he entered the waiting room, he was greeted by a nurse with an icy smile. Her name tag read Janet, but she hadn't made much of an impression beyond the tightness in her demeanor. As she ushered him into the sterile examination room, he noticed a subtle shift in her attitude, a coolness in her gaze, a clipped tone in her words. As Marcus laid on the examination table, Janet began to prepare his medical records, flipping through them with barely disguised disinterest. She asked him to change into a hospital gown, and that was when things started to feel strange. There was an air of discomfort, almost hostility, radiating from her .so, "What brings you in today?" she asked, though the question sounded more like an accusation. "Just a routine procedure," Marcus replied, his tone casual. "I've had this cyst for a while. Just needed to get it checked out." She nodded, but didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she focused on the clipboard in her hands. Janet muttered under her breath. "Should have had someone else take this shift." The remark was barely audible, but Marcus caught it slightly unnerved. He decided to ignore the comment, but as she prepped him for the procedure, the atmosphere thickened. It felt as though Janet was rushing through the motions too hurried, too sharp. She tried to make small talk, but there was something off in her tone, as though she was determined to create distance. Both physically and emotionally, Marcus, however, had seen the sharp glint of her eyes and noticed the tension building. He wasn't sure what was behind it, but something told him to be cautious. A few minutes into the procedure, the doctor, Dr. Harris, arrived. A friendly, warm man with a reputation for being thorough. He smiled at Marcus before turning to Janet. "Janet, can you get me the local anesthetic?" Dr. Harris asked the moment Janet turned away to fetch the anesthetic. Marcus's phone buzzed. He didn't typically look at it during appointments, but this time he saw the name on the screen, Vernon Walker, his longtime business partner. Without thinking, he quickly picked it up, expecting to talk shop for a moment. "What's up, Vernon?" he asked. As Janet returned with the medication, "I've got some good news on the new project we're launching," Vernon said, his voice brimming with excitement. "Also, the media is starting to catch wind of it. You might want to prepare for some questions. There's talk that they'll do a feature on you soon." Marcus smiled. But before he could respond, Janet's face twisted into an unmistakable look of disbelief. She froze, her eyes wide, her hands trembling slightly. Janet stammered. You're Marcus Williams." "Yeah, that's me," Marcus said, frowning as he noticed the shift in her energy. A T that moment. Janet's demeanor completely changed. The cold, guarded nurse was gone, replaced by someone who looked as though she had seen a ghost. Her voice trembled. "You're the one who runs all those companies, you're him. Aren't you?" Marcus wasn't sure how to respond, but the sharp change in her attitude wasn't lost on him. It was as if he had suddenly become someone she no longer viewed with indifference, but with something else entirely. "Something darker. I didn't know it was you," Janet continued, almost breathless now. She dropped the syringe she was holding, its metal clattering against the floor. Her face flushed as if she was realizing something far too late. "What's the problem?" Marcus asked, leaning slightly up on the table, his brows furrowing in confusion. "You're a black man and you're wealthy. You're him." Janet's voice was barely a whisper now. The look in her eyes, the way her hand clutched the edge of the counter, it was clear. The realization had shaken her, had cracked the facade of professional detachment before Marcus could process her words. She turned sharply toward Dr. Harris, her voice rising with a mix of fury and disbelief. "I can't work on this man. Not after everything I've heard. I can't." "Not him," Dr. Harris, looking confused. quickly asked, "What are you talking about, Janet?" "I didn't know," she repeated this time, her voice trembling with more anger. "I didn't know he was. He's the one who's been dominating the business world, making it harder for people like me to make it." The sudden shift from professionalism to blatant hostility was palpable, and Marcus's heart sank. "Janet, you need to leave," Dr. Harris said, his voice stern. "This is unprofessional, and I will be reporting this immediately." Janet stood still for a moment, her face conflicted, caught between the echo of her own prejudices and the immediate knowledge of her wrongdoing. With a sharp breath, she turned and stormed out of the room, leaving the door swinging behind her. The entire experience felt surreal to Marcus. The room was silent, save for the sound of his breathing. He looked at Dr. Harris, whose face was one of disbelief as well, but also a quiet empathy. "I'm sorry you had to experience that," Dr. Harris said, his voice calm but filled with regret. "That was completely unacceptable." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of it. He had spent his whole life working to prove himself, to build his company and reputation from the ground up. But for some, no matter how much success he had, he would always be reduced to something less than human based solely on his race. As he left the medical center later that day, his mind buzzed with mixed emotions. He was angered by Janet's prejudice, but also shaken by the realization that racism still had such a hold on people, even in spaces that should have been neutral, even compassionate. But he had something she didn't: a legacy, a purpose that could not be shaken by the ignorant prejudices of one person. He vowed to keep moving forward, knowing that his work and his existence would continue to challenge the limits people tried to place on him. And as for Janet, she was never seen in the hospital again. Dr. Harris made sure of it.